You're welcome to today's video. Now, today's video is on psycholinguistics, a subdiscipline of applied linguistics, which talks about language and the mind. So we'll be looking at language and the brain, cognition, and several other aspects of both linguistics and psychology. Now, take out your pen, take out your paper, and I will see you at the end of this video. Psycholinguistics. The term psycholinguistics was introduced by Jacob Robert Kantor, an American psychologist, in 1936 in his book titled An Objective Psychology of Grammar. Now we can see his picture down here, Jacob Robert Kantor. Now, psycholinguistics is a subdiscipline of applied linguistics that seeks to examine the psychological procedures involved when human beings attempt to use and grasp language. That psycholinguistic studies is based on speech development and language development, and it also throws light on how individuals of all ages comprehend and produce language. So here we have it that it is also known as the psychology of language, based on the fact that it explains how several linguistic principles and psychology work together. Okay, how they are interrelated, how they function together in explaining language acquisition and language processing. Now, psycholinguistics tries to describe speech and language development, especially in terms of course, humans, how humans understand and produce both spoken and written language. Now, this brings us to the fact that this subdiscipline of applied linguistics involves looking at mental representations. Now, when we're talking about mental representations, we mean our mind should go to certain queries, certain questions as to how are words stored in the mental lexicon. How do we recognize the components of sounds? How do we process written language? How is meaning actually represented in our memory? Okay, so such issues related to mental representations might operate on certain pedestal. Like I just asked a few questions. Of course, further questions that issues concerning mental processes operate would involve how do we recognize words effortlessly, or how do we analyze speech, phone by phone or phoneme by phoneme, how do we complete syllables of larger units? How is it possible for us to convert an idea to an utterance when we speak? How do we, as listeners, what exactly do we get from hearing an utterance? Okay, to the extent that we are developing our own representation of the ideas being expressed by that utterance. Okay, so these are questions that psycholinguistics tries to describe in relation to, of course, speech and language development. So, in a nutshell, what stages do we have to go through during the construction of utterances. Now the questions, they go on and on and on. Okay, so here we see that psycholinguistics involves studying mental representations, and such representations are often characterized or categorized into language use, language comprehension, and language storage. It therefore presupposes that psycholinguistics is a representation of the interdisciplinary overlapping of both aforementioned fields. Okay, so while psychology relates to the mind, linguistics is the scientific study of language. Okay, so psycholinguistics represents these two overlapping fields. Okay, so on its own, psychology constitutes the study of the human psyche or mind, while linguistics is the science of languages. Okay, basically, what we mean is that the main focus of psycholinguistics is the search for knowledge and understanding of how humans acquire, generate, and receive language. So, in a nutshell, psycholinguistics has to do with how people acquire language, how people use language to speak and understand others, how language is presented and processed in the brain, and finally, the brain versus the mind. Okay, so this subfield of psychology has to do with, or rather, is an interdisciplinary study, okay, of both psychology and linguistics. And of course, it's therefore related to developmental psychology, cognitive psychology, and neuro-linguistic and speech science. Okay, so we see a blend of psychology and linguistics. Now, moving on, the goal of psycholinguistics is to gain insights into how the human mind shapes communication. Okay, how the human mind shapes communication. Secondly, the goal is to identify patterns of linguistic behavior amongst language users. So we see psycholinguistics being explicated as a relationship between the human mind and language. Okay, as a sub-discipline of applied linguistics that explores how linguistic performance of individuals is determined by the mental apparatus. So basically, it is an interdisciplinary study. Now, according to Wale Adigbite 2013, he says that the psychologist's goal is to gain access into the mind of a person. Okay? The linguist takes, or rather, the linguist makes use of insights from psychology to comment on and to illuminate issues in linguistics, particularly how the human mind and behavior is reflected by or through language. Okay, so I believe this quotation is quite explanatory of what the goal of psycholinguistics is. Okay, so psycholinguistics study is characterized by several language areas. Okay, several language areas such as language structure. Now, when we talk about language structure, Under this subdiscipline, it is often investigated in terms of the rules for stringing several units of different sizes together, such as units such as morphemes, words, phrases, or groups of words, clauses, sentences into patterns for speech or for writing. Okay, that is when we refer to as language structure. Then we have language system. Now, this refers to choices made from different options of items or structures that often help in expressing our knowledge about the world, okay, such as our thoughts, our experiences, as participants, okay, processes that are involved, especially when it comes to communication. So we are looking at that level, we are looking at language system, and finally language skills, which refers to the basic skills of language: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So all of these areas regarding linguistic studies are relevant to psycholinguistics. Then issues in psychology, moving over from linguistic studies, we have issues in psychology that are also significant within this subdiscipline. Okay, so we have issues related to the mind, cognition, and human behavior. Now, all topics in both fields interface. Okay, we have looked at topics in language and we have looked at topics in psychology. They both interface and bring to the fore the fact that psycholinguistics is the acquisition, is the production, and is the reception of language as a reflection of human mind and behavior. So we can see that it is actually interdisciplinary. Okay, so when we talk about the mind, cognition, and behavior, of course, we should think of several aspects that are relevant to the brain. Okay, we should think of the human senses, such as sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. It also controls all the other motor skills pertaining to movement. So when we talk about the mind, or when we talk about psychology, we should be thinking of thought, thinking. We should be thinking of cognition, of course, like I said earlier on, where words associated with cognition, such as learning, knowing, comprehending, remembering, forgetting, all of these cognitive abilities. And like I mentioned earlier on, human behavior, okay, which has to do with when words connected, words can be reflective of the behavior or the motivation, attitude, and desire of a human being. So, all of this brought together, issues from psychology and topics from linguistics, is a blend of what psycholinguistics is all about. Therefore, psycholinguistics is a subdiscipline of applied linguistics, and it discusses topics such as language learning and acquisition, language thought and acquisition, cognition, child language development, language production and reception, language pedagogy, and language and the brain. Okay, so these are subtopics within the studies in psycholinguistics. Now, we're going to quickly move over to language and the brain. So we'll skip all others, language learning, acquisition, all of that. Our focus on this teaching is on language and the brain. Okay, so still on Ambiguity 2013, he categorizes the study of language and the brain into three sections for the purpose of simplicity of description. Okay, so we're going to look at these sections one after the other and try to understand how the brain, okay, how the brain is a major constituent of the nervous system. And of course, it features prominently in the study of human anatomy and physiology. Okay, so we have these sections, the human brain, lateralization of the brain, language localization in the brain, and impairments. So look at these three areas and try to understand the fact that while the mind represents the vital object of knowledge to the rational man, the brain provides the basis of experience in the view of empiricists. So we're going to begin with the brain hemisphere. Now, the brain is divided into three parts. We have the brain stem, which includes the medulla oblongata and several other parts, of course. Then we have the cerebellum. We have the cerebellum. And thirdly, we have the cerebrum. Now we're going to pay close attention to the cerebrum. It is a large and expanded part of the brain, and it relates to language in human beings. So that's where we're going to focus on, although from time to time we'll make reference to the cerebellum and the brainstem. Okay, so beginning with the cerebrum, which is also known as the cerebral cortex, it contains the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Now, the left hemisphere has four parts. The right hemisphere has four parts. Now, the four parts each has lobes. Okay, lobes. Now, these lobes are frontal, oriental, temporal, and occipital. Now, these are the four parts of the lobes within the left and the right hemispheres. So moving on, we want to look at this diagram closely. We can see the frontal lobe, we can see the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Okay, below we have the cerebellum and the brain stem, quite little as we can see there. And finally, to your far left, we have the temporal lobe. Now, looking at the frontal lobe, we'll see functions there: problem solving, judgment, inhibition of behavior. Okay, we see speaking, expressive language. That's why we are paying attention to. We're paying attention to the cerebrum because it is basically concerned with language. Then we have the parietal, where we see some functions there also: reading, writing, math, calculation, academic skills, and a whole lot. Now, paying close attention to these brain functions will help in understanding how psychology and linguistic systems actually overlap. Now, looking at lateralization of the brain hemispheres, we'll just briefly say here that there is a division of labor within the cerebrum. Now, while the left hemisphere controls right side of the body, the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. You might need to go back to the diagram to understand what we're saying. Okay, so when we're looking at this lateralization, we discover that these hemispheres, they have functions. The left hemisphere for language, is for logical and analytical operations, okay, including mathematics, speech, and sound perception. However, the right hemisphere has its own functions, such as emotions and face recognition, processing of noise, and non-linguistic sounds. So we must understand that within the lateralization of the brain hemispheres, these hemispheres play their individual roles. Okay, language localization in the brain. Now, language centers prevail in the left hemisphere, particularly in right-handed people. So we are looking at the localization of language within the brain. And we are saying that language is, the language center prevails more in the left hemisphere, especially in right-handed people. Now, sometimes for left-handed people, it is in the right hemisphere. Now, the main language centers are the left hemisphere, which is the Broca's area, the Wernicke's area, and the Angular Gyrus. Okay, these areas, Broca's areas, Wernicke's area, and the Angular Gyrus, they are the centers for language, which is within the left hemisphere. Now, the Broca's area has the muscles that control speech. So you can see how significant the Broca's area is when it comes to language, when it comes to speaking, okay, when it comes to articulation. Then we have the Wernicke's area. This area is near the part of the brain that receives stimuli. Okay, so regarding speech production, utterances are formed within the Wernicke's area. And here, speech signals are interpreted. So all areas within these hemispheres are very significant and they are very vital for language and speech production. Now, finally, for this teaching, we want to quickly mention a few language impairments. Now, there are 5 neural systems. Okay, so we have what has been categorized as sensory, analyzing systems, language systems, motor command, and finally neuromotor. Now, these systems are very vital, and if they are damaged in any way, it could result in language impairment, such that if the sensory system is damaged, we could have sensory impairment. Language system is damaged, we could have language disability. The motor command is damaged, we could have inability to articulate speech sounds. So psycholinguistics, like we are trying to establish, is that it has to do with psychology and it has to do with language. And like we said earlier on, it is also known as the psychology of language.